Okay, good afternoon to everyone. It is our pleasure as the editor of the International Journal of Romani Studies to welcome you to this third webinar. We are very happy because today we will be joined by authors who have published their contributions that we are going to be listening to them in the last two issues of our journal that they are open access, so you can all download them and read them and discuss and cite these works. With them, and as it is tradition in our webinar series, we will open discussion at the end. So we encourage you to raise any question, any comment that you might have on these papers. That they are all tackling crucial and really important and timing debates within Romani studies. So we are gonna follow the order of the program, but first of all, we have to apologize because Aluízio de Azevedo Silva Júnior is not going to be able to be with us today due to health reasons. So we are going to miss his presentation, but we hope to allocate it to another webinar. So for today, we are going to have three papers. So I'm going to be introducing the speakers separately, so you will hear. So I'm going to be introducing the first speaker, who is Regan John Eminson, and he is, hold on, he's a master's student of Romani descent from the University of Sussex and an intersectional researcher and consultant. And his paper is called Caught in the Crossfire, LGBT plus Traveller Intersectionality in Post-Brexit Britain. So I think that I will give the floor to Regan John because we all want to listen to his work.
Thank you. Sorry, would you mind just enabling the screen sharing feature?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Now you can do it.
So my paper is the LGBT Traveller Intersectionality in Post-Brexit Britain. Just to start off with the context of why I conducted the paper. Post-Brexit, the UK saw a very difficult and changing socio-political environment. It became a relatively increasingly hostile space for LGBT and GRT people. Notably, hate crime has increased since 2016. This cannot be directly considered causational as a result of Brexit, but more so looks correlative. Globally, as some of you may know, we've seen a massive increase in far-right groups advancing in societies. Particularly, we've seen far-right organisations reaching political stages, and in response to this, particularly the GRT community in the UK has seen an increase in conservatism. This has made it very difficult to perform both LGBT and traveller identities, and I analyse this through an intersectional lens. So the method I used in order to conduct my study, I used an online survey, which I spread mainly through social media. I primarily chose this platform because I conducted the full scale of my research during the lockdown in the UK. I used snowball sampling just to gather participants, hence why I didn't get as many as I hoped for initially. Primarily, I wanted to sort of diversify on the research that has previously been issued. So I based a great deal of my work on which was conducted by Dr. Daniel Baker. He performed research primarily looking at the LGBT intersectionality of gay Romani men. I based my research to sort of develop upon where he left off. as a means of sort of forwarding the scope, the scale, and sort of the inclusion that we could have to the diverse diaspora that exists in the UK. I used the mixed methods, both quantitative and qualitative approach in my surveys, which generated some very interesting results onto what is the lived experience of contemporary LGBT traveller people. So firstly, I'll be looking at the results that I gathered from the LGBT Traveller survey. This survey is focused on aspects of discrimination, on performing identity, and sort of culminated it into sort of quite some interesting outcomes. Firstly, I want to highlight this graph that is included in my paper about people's feelings of being included into the LGBT community. As we can see, a majority of participants who were involved in the survey felt like they could not share their identity to the wider LGBT community in the UK, which I thought was a quite interesting outcome. But I compared this against feelings of people who experience discrimination within the LGBT community. So what I found quite interesting was a correlation between people experiencing higher levels of discrimination in the LGBT community when compared to non-traveller LGBT. From this, I sort of concluded that people were hiding their identities in order to escape the high levels of discrimination which is prevalent in LGBT community. Primarily, this discrimination came in the form of the theme I identified as stereotyping, which is something it's very prominent in media, particularly. It's something which is pushed quite heavily through shows and programs that we see in the UK. And there's this one example here of where people were using stereotypes of Romani people in order for entertainment value in LGBT spaces, which is I think quite distressing to hear, especially in the 21st century, to hear that sort of level of imitation and trying to push stereotypes. I think this respondent really summed it up pretty well. Yeah, just sort of displaying sort of, you know, how these stereotypes are seeping into LGBT society, and there is no escape outside of wider British society in the LGBT community when it comes to evading stereotypes and discriminatory attitudes. In addition to this, I also noted that a number of respondents highlighted how when performing both LGBT and traveller identities, there was a lot of conflict, not just from the LGBT community, but also from traveller communities. Notably, as previously stated, there has been sort of an increase in conservative attitudes, which I largely gauge as a sort of response to the widening rise of right-wing populist attitudes, which has sort of forced the GRT community in the UK to become more conservative in order to sort of weather the impacts of sort of like a sort of, I would say, sort of putting up a barrier to outside influences. Primarily, heteronormativity in traveller society has sort of taken a role in separating LGBT people in the traveller community from the wider traveller community. Non-conforming to heteronormativity was seen as something that would downgrade your identity as a traveller individual. So you couldn't perform both traveller identity and LGBT identity, because in the eyes of some respondents that we saw, both cannot be done without you being considered gadgetified, as you becoming gorger if you take on these identities which are seen external to the traveller community. I then compared the results I had with the non-traveller community, who I surveyed separately. what I found quite interesting was a lack of knowledge over the GRT community. That was something that was very prominent in the non-traveller LGBT community, with a very small amount of respondents stating that they have quite a bit of knowledge about the GRT community. In addition to this, opinions of the GRT community tended to be quite neutral, with people not really taking a clear stance, showing their sort of lack of knowledge through their opinions. People could not generally form too strong of opinion when asked directly. In addition to this, I asked about whether LGBT travellers should be included in LGBTQ spaces. 90.2% said yes, but my question was, why was there such positive response to a community that most people had no strong opinions over or had very limited knowledge to? In conducting further research into this, I came up with the possible theory that maybe it might be an instance of power play or fetishization. I correlated this alongside sort of the working class fetishization that we see in the UK. In some LGBT spaces, we have what we call chav nights. For those not from the UK, chav is a derogatory term which is generally used against working class people. In these events, we see hyper-masculinized individuals fetishized at wide-scale events. And I feel possibly maybe that might be the reason for the willfulness for inclusion. It may not necessarily be because people want inclusion of GRT people in LGBT spaces, but more so might be a power play or sort of fetishization of traveller people. In addition to this, most people did agree that traveller discrimination is an important issue, but once again, I may feel this might be an aspect of maybe sort of tokenism or linking back to the idea of fetishism in LGBT spaces. Because in addition to this, a number of past participants, about up to 30% from the LGBT non-traveller community, expressed instances of blaming minorities by saying it's, for example, it's the small group from your community which are giving your wider group a bad name. This is something which is heavily pushed in the media of the UK. Particularly, you see sort of quite aggressive headlines towards the demonization of traveller communities, which is something which is seeped into the fabric of LGBT society, I believe. The experience of LGBT travellers is something which has not changed significantly, I feel, in the past 10 years. There has been little to no progress, particularly in either community. In terms of traveller community, there has been a wave of conservatism, of trying to conserve culture. In addition to this, evangelicalism has been something which has also been quite prominent in spreading throughout traveller society. Of course, in combination of this, these conservative attitudes are then further reinforced by religious narratives, which I believe might have led to the I did additionally do a bit on the GRT inclusion of LGBT people and opinions. Unfortunately, didn't fit into this paper, but the results from that was actually quite interesting in showing the sort of lack of acceptance of LGBT people on the whole. What is quite concerning is, through looking for the research, there was a significant increase in the far-right populism, which has seen a rise in discriminatory attitudes. Sort of progressing from this paper, there seemed to be sort of a bit of a downwards trajectory in British society. LGBT. When I was first conducting the research for this paper, there was an image of a caravan site which had been burnt down in a racist attack. during this sort of initial research phase of this project, and I think that's something that's quite stuck into into the back of my mind when I was conducting this research, just to what extent anti-traveller rhetoric had seeped into British society and had become definitely more prominent in recent years. And just to sort of go on from that, really, sort of looking into sort of the future beyond this research, in the short time that this research was conducted up until now, you know, discriminatory attitudes have only progressed further, which you could say maybe is a byproduct of the Brexit situation, particularly leaving the EU, has led to these rising discriminatory attitudes, which in turn has now led to new discriminatory legislation. Particularly now we're seeing the implementation of the police crime courts and sentencing bill, the PCSE bill, which has recently gone through, which further criminalises traveller communities. Additionally, the UK has also seen a drop in standards for LGBT rights, and has also recently rejected human rights. So just to correlate that back to my work, I think that was something that was definitely on the horizon and could be seen, and probably a byproduct of the Brexit result and the increasing far-right populist attitudes. But on the whole, I think it was quite interesting to see the difficulties in negotiating these identities. There was I felt there's a real conflict amongst the sample groups, between sort of battling between a sort of very conservative, homogenized identity in the various traveller groups, and also battling sort of the own self-acceptance as well as acceptance within the community of LGBT, who on the whole displayed quite positive attitudes, but when it came to nitpicking the individual views and points, seemed to still harbour many of the aspects that affect wider British society. So yeah, that's pretty much the full scope of my research. It was very interesting to conduct, and hopefully this is something that we can progress only upwards from. Hopefully it won't get much worse, but that is yet to be seen. Yes, thank you.
Thank you, Regan. You have kept perfectly to the time, to the 15 minutes, and it's been really, really interesting. And we have already many questions in my mind, but I'm sure that from the audience we'll got also a lot of clarifying and important questions of this really, really, really crucial issue that you are raising. So we are going to move to the second paper of today. Who is going to be by the hand of Teri. Szűcs. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing very well all the names. And Teri will present representations of epistemological colonization, historical memory in Béla Osztojkán's There is Nobody to Pay Jóska Átyin. And Teri Szűcs is a literary historian, critic, and independent researcher. She gained her PhD at Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest in 2009, with research focusing on the literature of the Holocaust, as well as Hungarian Romani cult literature. Currently, she's a lecturer at the Budapest Corvinus University and an assistant professor at Eötvös Loránd University. She's the author of The History of Forgetting, the Witness of the Holocaust in Literary Works. And in 2014, she was the consultant to the exhibition The Remembrance of the Holocaust in Literature at the Budapest Petőfi Literary Museum. Teri Szűcs is also a member of the Eötvös Loránd University Research Group, Spacing Otherness, Cultural Images of Space, Contact Zones in Contemporary Hungarian and Romanian Film and Literature. So I'm going to give the floor to Teri to present her paper. Are you going to share?
Thank you. I will do a bit of screen sharing, but I didn't prepare with anything this nice and ordered, as we have seen in the previous presentation. I just want to give you a glimpse of this title of the novel. Then I will try to establish eye contact with you all. And towards the end of my presentation, in the last 5 minutes, I would like to divert from the paper, and I want to show you something very beautiful. So I will do a bit of screen sharing for this reason, but since I'm focusing on literature, I didn't really come with a very orderly presentation. It's rather a chain of thoughts. So could I share my screen with you? Yeah, okay, so representations of epistemological colonization, historical memory in Béla, Osztojkán's There is Nobody to Pay, Jóska, Átyin. There is Nobody to Pay, Jóska, Átyin is a really interesting novel that I recommend to everyone who reads in French or Polish or Hungarian. Unfortunately, the English or German or Spanish translation does not exist as of yet. This novel was my inspiration for this chain of thoughts, together with another one, which is called the English official translation, because it was published in the US quite recently, is The Color of Smoke, written by Menyhért Lakatos. The Color of Smoke was published in 1975. There is Nobody to Pay, Jóska, Átyin was published in 1997. And they are outstanding novels within the Hungarian literature and within the Hungarian Romani literature. They are both historical novels. They both focus on the history of a Romani settlement, and they both focus on a very interesting and troubled time in Hungarian history. The Color of Smoke takes place during the Second World War and the Holocaust, the Romani Holocaust, while this one, There is Nobody to Pay, Jóska, Átyin, takes place in the early 50s. And the other thing that connects the two novels is that they both look back on the previous, let's say, 4 decades. So the first half of the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century within Hungarian history and within Hungarian Romani history. And then, so this was my starting point. And now I'm coming back to make a bit of eye contact with you. What I also found fascinating in having these novels is how they mix factual knowledge, historical knowledge, with, let's say, magical knowledge and lack of knowledge. They both have a very carnivalistic texture. So what I was very interested in the first place is this fluctuation between knowledge and lack of knowledge as they are related to Romani history, the history of the Romani people in Europe, in Hungary. So the first question of my article, let's say, is what is epistemological oppression or epistemological colonization? And the second question is, how does artistic knowledge production reflect on it? How does artistic knowledge production, in this case, literature, uncover epistemological colonization, and does it well, it does. So then how does it offer ways of, let's say, artistic knowledge production and resilience? So the starting point was to argue that we can apply post-colonial studies to Romani studies, that we can talk about the history of the intra-European colonial other when we talk about the history of the European Roma. The second step was to see whether indigenous studies can give us really tools to carry on with this chain of thoughts. And because my focus was on historical novels, I had a look at Dipesh Chakrabarty's concept of heterotemporality. And what I found important to stress is that the hetero part of this heterotemporality is actually a hierarchical structure of powerful and weak narratives. This hierarchy is always inscribed into the heterogeneity of historiographies. That is, the plurality of heterotemporal narratives is always inherently hierarchical because it is a political construction. So this was my starting point. This is from where I wanted to take a step further. And now, as I was preparing, I called this step further Roma and time, because the real question here is, talking about these novels, trying to understand them, is whether epistemological oppression results in not owning the story, the narrative, the history, and the historiography of a community. And then what are the consequences of being deprived of this kind of ownership? The consequences are, for example, as we all know, the associations between Roma and forgetting, between those claims that Roma do not really care of their past as much as other communities, let's say in Europe, or in a more like seemingly descriptive way that the Roma are a presentist people compared to those who have a more developed, let's say, historical sensitivity. I think, and I'm not alone with being convinced that these claims are the results of epistemological colonization, which expropriates the ability of owning one's history. And since both novels have very strong references to the Romani Holocaust, and since the case of the Romani Holocaust is making all these anomalies and the struggle for the recognition of the remembrance of the Romani Holocaust makes these anomalies very visible, I would like to stress that the claim for the acknowledgement of the Romani suffering during the Holocaust aims not only for the recognition of the genocide, but the point here is, since 1970, since the issue is so much in the front line of political activism. So the point is that it articulates the demand for historiographical visibility and the inscription of a people into European history. So it's a point of time, an event of history through which this inscription can take place, through which then, let's say, the grand narrative of the history of the Roma can enter the collective European historical narrative. Partly to show the anomalies, how this doesn't work, I refer to the fights around memorialization and the history and the debates surrounding the memorials of the Romani Holocaust in Europe, as well as the work of those scholars who try to describe the situation of the archives regarding the Romani Holocaust. The state of the archival preservation of the memory of the Romani Holocaust reveals all these anomalies of institutional remembrance, as these institutions are where historiography intersects with social hierarchy and power relations. I'm referring to Ari Joskovic, Agnes Daroci, and János Bársony in the Hungarian context, but also you can think of the works of Ethel Brooks in this respect. So from here on, I would like to move towards artistic knowledge production. We know how important art is in the pool of Romani knowledge production, partly because of the problems I was trying to talk about beforehand, but partly also because of I believe, because of the capabilities of art, because art can synthesize, it can reflect on the hiatus, but it can also create, so to say, the utopia of knowledge and agency. So this is what is happening in these novels, or in this novel that I was writing about. Osztojkán gives account of the fate of a marginalized Hungarian Romani community. As I said, in the 50s, their memories stretch back to the First World War, to the Second World War, to the Horthy era, but the text always points out that it is not encyclopedic knowledge, so to say. It is not structured knowledge, it is not owned knowledge, it's more traumatic knowledge. For example, when the community is persecuted in the 50s in a communist forced labor camp-like setting in the so-called peace city, then there is one elderly member of the community who has flashbacks of the Holocaust. The text does not use the word flashback, and of course doesn't use the word Holocaust. We are reading about traumatic memory popping up because one trigger triggers the other. So there is a sequence of traumas. So from here on, I moved over to the issue of trauma, which became a very frequently used word, for example, in Holocaust studies, Holocaust scholarship, But when we are talking about the history, the literature of the Romani Holocaust, we cannot use the same kind of understanding of the trauma as we use regarding, let's say, the Jewish suffering, because of the fact that let's say the Western understanding of trauma is focused on the event and the memory of the event and processing the event, while when we are talking about colonial trauma, racial trauma, and in this respect, traumas associated or happening within the European Romani history, these are intertwined, long-term traumatic sequences that might not even have an end. We are talking about layers of ongoing trauma in which the Romani Holocaust marks an event, but it does not mark the end of anything. I see that some of you are nodding, and I hope I'm making sense. The other kind of finding coming from literary scholarship in the paper is related to the use of magic realism, which on one hand is a really good way of reflecting on the fluctuation of knowing and not knowing, of owning knowledge and being deprived of knowledge. On the other hand, it's a very good tool to traumatize the reader. What I mean by this is that both texts create a sense of confusion in the reader, and they make it absolutely apparent that we ourselves are lacking sufficient knowledge about Roma history. And in this respect, I think these are the points where the reader can face her or his position, you know, being a privileged reader who's uninformed, or being an unprivileged reader who is deprived of the knowledge of her own people's history. The third interesting way of facing magic realism in these novels is referring once again to this fluctuation of not knowing and knowing, reality and magic, is that we must consider magic, the magical part, as knowledge. Otherwise the text doesn't make sense. So in these novels turn around the epistemological hierarchy. That was the starting point of my chain of thought. Towards the end of the article, I go once more to the trauma, to the notion of the trauma, from which we just need to make one more step to be able to talk about lives not grievable or less grievable, as Judith Butler calls them. So the whole issue here has to do with this kind of societal positioning as well. So from epistemological colonization, through the deprivation of one's own historical narrative, we arrive to unacknowledged traumas, and from unacknowledged historical traumas, we arrive to ungrievable lives. And I give an example in my paper, which is as you all know, the terrorist attacks in 2008 and 9 against Hungarian Roma families, in which 6 people were killed. Among them, there was a little boy. And the trial was a clear case of another kind of epistemological deprivation, where the knowledge about the legal system was, for obvious racial reasons, not given to the main participants of the case, who were re-traumatized once again in the events of the trial, which was a very, very long time. And there is a very precise and good documentary about it, Judgment in Hungary, mark the reference to the Holocaust once again here. And I'm really advising you to see it if you haven't seen it yet. And just to end on maybe a more resilient note, I want to show you 2 artworks. If I have time, I don't know. Am I?
You have around 20 minutes, but show the artwork. And
I will be very quick. So here is a photo of a tableau, which is actually 41 square meters. It was painted by Tamás Péli in 1983. And if you will be in Kassel at the Documenta from June to September, you can see it. Péli was one of the greatest Hungarian Romani painters. I'm showing you this painting because it's a visual representation of what I call the epistemological utopia of recreating the historical narrative here around the goddess Kali. You can see unfolding through these symbolic images the Hungarian Romani history. Here is the Holocaust, for example, on the bottom. And there is another circle around the central images where figures of the Hungarian Romani intelligentsia in the 80s are painted, and you can identify them by their face. So they are portraits. So it's a 3-layered work of knowledge of the creation of the Roma, the history of the Roma, the present time of the Roma of the 80s, and let's say the utopia of having this all in one painting. The other work, very quickly, which will be exhibited next to it in Kassel, is the work of Małgorzata Mirgatas, who, as you know, made a very powerful artwork for the Venice Biennale now, where with practically the same logic as Péli, she's recreating an assembly of historical the missing European Romani historical knowledge with figures of the present and figures of the past. And I just show you very quickly the work of hers that will be exhibited in Kassel next to Tamás Péli's work. It's called Out of Egypt, and it's a remake of Jacques Callot's famous representations of the Roma on his etchings. And this is what it looks like in Małgorzata Mirgatas's version. I consider it as an act of resilience in Romani art, and this is where I am my presentation. Thank you. Thanks. I need to stop sharing the screen.
Thank you, Teri. I think it's been really thought-provoking, and you connected many dots that I'm sure that a lot of questions will raise. So we are going to move to the last presentation this afternoon, and it's going to be by the hand of Peter Brizu. Peter is a Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow undertaking research within the Institute of Diplomacy and International Governance. So we can see here a very wide breadth of disciplines coming together. Dr. Peter Brizu's research lies in the area of discourse and racism, with a special focus on the representation of the Roma in European media and political discourse. And he works under the framework of the multimodal critical discourse analysis that we will hear also to examine practices of discrimination and social exclusion with regards to Roma and other marginalized communities. And Peter is going to be presenting the paper that published in the International Journal of Romani Studies, Humor and Anti-Roma Racism in Romanian Television News, a multimodal critical discourse analysis. So the floor is you, Peter.
Hello, everyone. I was trying to share my screen, but unfortunately, there's some settings that I haven't done, so I think we are losing time. So I will just go without a PowerPoint.
We can habilitate it you quickly if you want.
Yeah, so let me share. Okay, so let's start.
It's up to you. I mean, it's up to you.
System. I'll try to do this like that. Okay, unlock. Sorry. Anyways, for some reasons, it doesn't allow me because I'm on a university computer, so I don't really know what it is. Thank you so much for organizing this event. And I was very happy to have my article published in the International Journal of Roma Studies. As Teresa said, I am currently a Marie Curie Fellow, and I work on a project on Romaphobia in the age of populism. And today I will talk about my paper on humor and anti-Roma racism in Romanian television news. Now, before I go into discussing this article, I'd like to just present some contextual information. Now, we all know that Romaphobia, or racism against the Roma, has a very, very long history in Europe. Roma have been historically victims of extreme violence and social exclusion, especially during their slavery in Eastern Europe. We're talking about 500 years of slavery in Romania. We talk about the extermination by the Nazis during the Holocaust, but also their ongoing systemic oppression and marginalization across Europe in healthcare, housing, education, and employment. So in a way, we can say that racism in its various forms continues to affect the lives of millions of Roma in Europe, and racism remains the main cause for the extreme discrimination, socioeconomic inequalities, health disparities, but also everyday indignity suffered by European Roma. Now, despite their marginalized status, Roma's image in the media, and I would say in all institutionalized discourses, has been often associated with negative attributes in relation to criminality, in relation to primitiveness, antisocial behavior, but also reluctance to follow the laws and regulations. There are a lot of great studies out there that have pointed out to various strategies through which media reproduce racism, yet one aspect that has been less explored was the role of humor and ridicule to disguise anti-Roma racism. A look at the literature, we see that in the post-racial societies or colorblind societies, overt forms of racism are no longer tolerated, And therefore, humor, as well as other strategies, have emerged as ways through which racism can be concealed, can be denied, or presented as fun, as an enjoyment, and therefore criticism can be dismissed. I think we all remember the disturbing joke made by Jimmy Carr in relation to Romani victims killed in the Holocaust. And this is just one example of how racism and hate speech can at times be dismissed under the guise of humor and having fun. Now, a little bit more about humor and racism. Academic literature informs us that humor can be used to mock ethnic groups perceived to be culturally and socially inferior. Humor is also used to reproduce ideas about racial superiority in order to maintain contemporary social hierarchies, inequalities, and social exclusion. Now, there are also studies out there that point out to these positive functions of humor, but for me, the interest was more on the harmful role of humor. And this is because humor and ridicule are not innocent strategies. Joking can have that form of disciplinary power and serves serves concrete ideological functions. For example, as we said, to mock individuals, to position them as inferior, to further marginalize them. So in this sense, humor and joking can be about display of power, and this also can relate to gender, can relate to social class, but as I said in this paper, I was more interested in the construct of race and ethnicity. So in terms of data and methods, this is actually part of one of my previous research projects that was on the representation of the Roma in Romanian press, Romanian television, and social media. So obviously this is a section on television, and in the television section, I collected 81 news clips from 2014 and 2018, and what we can say, Roma's public image on television. And I would be really interested to see what's the Roma's public image in Hungary or in other countries. But this is the situation in Romania. In Romania, this image oscillates between either extreme poverty or extreme wealth. So, if poor, Roma are reprimanded for visually assaulting the public with their primitive, unruly, unhealthy lifestyle, or embarrassing the Romanians with their begging practices in the countries where they go. If they go to the UK, to Spain, to Italy. Now, if they are rich, they also despair the audiences with their arrogance, with their ignorance, but also with irrational behavior. So in this paper, I chose to focus on those wealthy Roma. How are they represented on television? So I chose two news clips, and one of the news clips featured an extravagant Roma wedding, and the other one talks about a mundane lifestyle of a so-called Roma royal families. Both news clips were aired by Antena 1, which is one of the leading Romanian TV stations. And what is of particular interest in this paper is that both news clips rely on humor and ridicule to mark power and to stratify people into higher and lower classes. So I show how humor and ridicule are not neutral in communication, but they serve well-defined ideological functions, to claim racial superiority by disciplining a group of people which are believed to violate the boundaries of dominant norms and values. But I also highlighted, as a media scholar, how through the affordances of television, to substitute, to erase, abstract, you resequence discourses. And in this way, these events are unproblematically presented to the public in ways which invite laughter, ridicule, and therefore they conceal racism. In terms of methods, I draw on multimodal critical discourse analysis. This is a very well-established tradition in critical discourse studies. Basically, what I do a close examination of every mode of communication, whether it's language, whether it's audiovisual footage, whether it's music. So I look clearly how Roma are represented through these varying modes of communication. And my concept of multimodality relies on social semiotics, or is rooted in social semiotics, on the ground that all these semiotic resources, and when I say semiotic resource, I mean language, captions, everything that goes into the production of these news clips are not random. They are active, okay? So this is very important. They're active choices of those who produce, and then they seek to disseminate these discourses. Now, I'll go a little bit through one of the clips. So the first clip that I analyzed, it's called Weddings with Helicopters, right? Very interesting. Wedding with helicopters for teenage couple, right? So basically, this reports on an extravagant wedding, which involved, lavish spendings on helicopters, limousines, fancy carriages, and fancy outfits. And one thing that I would like to mention, as soon as these news clips were aired on Antena Uno, they became viral on social media, on YouTube, on Facebook, probably on Instagram. I don't have Instagram, so I don't know. But they became viral, but they also became the source of parodies and other entertainment shows. Now, the manner in which this extravagant event is introduced to the public is very relevant for understanding the nature of such reporting. Because if you look at the people on the screen, they're very nicely dressed. They could be easily associated with wealthy, refined individuals, if you want to say with celebrities, yet the assumption easily is disbanded once they start talking and acting, okay? So in critical discourse studies, we call this discursive incongruencies, because it's something you see visually, but when people start talking, you start laughing. And the laughing is not because people are racially, it's not because of the race, it's because of their poor language proficiency, which in Romanian context, it's associated with, lack of education, illiteracy. The laughter is about their behavior, the lack of mannerism, and inappropriate behavior and lack of taste. If you want to say the entire clip is sequenced as funny moments, and each of these funny moments is either connected with a language variety spoken by the people, their behavior, or their lack of taste. So in Bourdieu's terms, we can say that Roma are some kind of overnight rich, some parvenus, which implies that Roma might have accumulated the material resources, to have all these weddings with helicopters and Swarovski dresses and so on, but they lack the cultural capital. So being part of the red carpet event requires people to demonstrate, adequate behavior, mannerism, taste, and appropriate communication skills. Instead, the Roma, in this circumstance, they become the target of the joke, or the butt of the joke for those viewers, obviously, who regard themselves as superior. Also, I mentioned previously that another important aspect is that the laughter has nothing to do with the race. So it's very difficult to say, oh, this is racist. This is racist. So Roma are belittled, as I said, based on their communication skills, on their taste and behaviors. But as scholars emphasized, these forms of racism are in fact acts of aggression, especially since they do not target individual people, they target collective identities. Anyways, I won't go through the second clip because I think I will leave more time for discussion. But what I would like to conclude with, humor and ridicule about ethnic minorities are not innocent strategies, especially in institutionalized discourses such as media, as they definitely construct the Roma as an inferior group of people. And this manner of representation is very problematic, because on the one hand, perpetuates these inequalities and the power relations between Roma and non-Roma, gloss over the long history of racism against the Roma in Romania. And I will end with this. While such television programs claim to provide information about the lives of the Roma, about their traditions and their culture, they actually fail miserably to do so. Instead, they acquaint the public with a community whose cultural practices are so different from the non-Romas and whose values and behaviors are incomprehensible. Lavish weddings, helicopters, Swarovski, and so on. So, in fact, these programs, whether it's an entertainment show or if it's a news clip, they exploit the Roma for cheap laughs in a fashion that would be totally unacceptable for any other ethnic minority. Thank you very much. And I apologize, I wish I had had the PowerPoint, but I can send it to you.
Thank you, Peter. It's been really good. I think that it's been a very good combination of different topics, different issues. So now it's time for the audience to ask questions. I can see some of them. I mean, people have been sharing resources and links to very interesting, not only to the articles, to the 3 articles, but also to other related and connected resources. There was a question of to Teri about the 2 artists that you have mentioned. If you can repeat the names or maybe write down to the chat. That was one question. Yes. Write down the name of the painters that you have been talking at the end of your speech. This is a question by Ines Aydin. Yeah. I already replied, sorry. And then there is another question for Teri. To what extent do you think that the literature you have mentioned has been discovered by both Roma and non-Roma literature?
That's a very interesting question, and it's a separate research. So what happened in 1975 with the first historical novel is that the Kadar era's cultural politics grabbed it, and they wanted to make that book as a, as a proof of not having Roma problem in Hungary. It's a very, very strange political trick. So in 1975, many people read it. It was part of the cultural canon, and it was translated to multiple languages. And then it fell out of a public conscience. The other novel, maybe the same, a small, I mean, not the same because there was no Kadar era anymore, but a small circle read it, and then it fell out of the public knowledge in a literature which is very much focused in historical novel. Historical novel is the favorite genre of Hungarian literature, yet there are 2 such brilliant works that for obvious reasons couldn't get to their place in the canon. And the same happened to the grand painting that I showed you which had to be dragged out of storage recently. It was put to the periphery of our culture so much. The fact that there are Roma authors who want to represent Romani identities turns this kind of literature into political literature in the perception of the Hungarian readers, which is of lesser artistic value as the so-called non-political literature, I guess you can follow. And from then on, it just falls out of the canon. So it's a hard work to prove that these are artworks, actually. And we need to talk about them as artworks. So this is what happened. And regarding, so I just answered the first part of the question. The second part is whether the Roma readers embrace them as their own. Yeah, this is a work to do. Thanks for the question.
Well, I imagine that it's also a challenging question to answer. I mean, but it's really interesting. And you also mentioned that these artworks now are both are under an exhibition, right? So we can go to.
Yes, Małgorzata Mirgatasis' grand work is on display at the Venice Biennale. It's a big thing. It's the first such artwork in a national pavilion. Of course, there was a Romani pavilion curated by Timea Junghaus, and Eriak's attempts to have Roma artists at the Venice Biennale are very important. But the case of Mirgatasis is different with the Polish pavilion, and and the Documenta in Kassel, which is a very important grand showcase of contemporary art, is where within the so-called Roma MoMA project, these two works will somehow mirror each other through their historical narratives. Thanks.
Thank you, Teri. I think that there are more questions. One is for Peter by Fernando Matias, and he said that when this occurs, what's the reaction from other national mainstream media stations regarding this type of racist news clips are published? Is there condemnation? Have this type of media change over time?
Yeah, thank you very much, Fernando, for the question. I would say there is not a lot of variety when it comes, there's not much variation when it comes to the representation of the Roma in different media. So I think they benefit, unfortunately, from a very negative image across the mainstream media in Romania. And unfortunately, these assumptions are very little challenged. And I think this is our job as academics as well. You know, we publish, and I remember I published about an article in Discourse and Society, disseminated the comments to this very wedding song. And actually, that Facebook outlet who shared that news clip had to take it down. So, you know, there are little changes, but I guess not so much. Very little challenged, actually.
I would have a follow-up question for Peter. So is there an official institution or official committee in which people, citizens, or even Roma civic organizations can place complaints about this type of?
Obviously, yes, there is, but I guess probably the laws are very little reinforced. So even if you complain, like, for example, if you complain about a clip like this one that I presented, they would say, well, there's nothing racist about this. Where's the racism? It's just fun.
And what you said that,
And
and
people choose to
that-
represent themselves. They will say they choose to represent themselves as such. They are the ones who invited media to their wedding. So what are you complaining about?
okay, thank you, Peter. I think it's a really deep and
Yeah.
an important topic that it's, as you said, it's a crosswords. And then we will move to Regan, because you have a couple of questions. The first one is posted by Emilia Yello, and she says, a methodological aspect, how was the process of doing two online surveys during the lockdown in this particular research group? And also something about the social reality you explained. Is there any type of organized action taking place and emerging from the LGBT plus traveler community to contest the situation that you explained?
So for the first question, I have to say it was extremely difficult to conduct research in a full-blown lockdown. It was very, very difficult to try and get participants. I was sort of in a way thinking, oh my God, what if I don't? So it was a bit touch and go. I was surprised at the response. I appreciate it may have restricted my findings a bit by isolating my research solely to looking at people who have access to you know, social media accounts and online research. Just to answer the second question, yes, there is organisation emerging from LGBT travellers. Notably, there's an organisation in the UK called Traveller Pride, which is actively taking a part in London Pride, sort of promoting the awareness of both LGBT and traveller people, and they do sort of a lot of interesting, cool events where they create spaces specifically for LGBT travellers in order to come together and discuss issues facing them.
This is very connected to Isaac Blake question, also posted to you, Regan, who said, has the pursuit of the LGBTQ Romani and traveller rights and recognition become detached from the wider advocacy of Roma rights in general, to the extent that it is a separated issue? If it has, is this a positive or a negative development? And a third question is that if there is any gray areas and points of complexity that you notice when you're thinking about this topic.
So thank you for the questions. Just to answer the first question, I think to a degree, LGBT Roma and traveller rights have become somewhat detached from the wider narrative. Of course, in instances, especially sort of when we're seeing protests at the minute, and sort of rallies organising it against government discrimination, discriminatory policies, there is still a bit of, I'd say, awkwardness around the inclusion, particularly of symbols of displaying LGBT rights. So I think in a way there is still that detachment, but hopefully in the future we could see those lines becoming a bit more blurred. And yes, I hope this will be, at the minute it's a positive development, I'd say, just to raise awareness separately of LGBT traveller rights as an intersectional identity. But I hope it will come back to the wider issues and sort of join up with wider issues being faced by traveller society. In terms of the second question, grey areas and points of complexity, it's a very complex topic, I think, especially in the UK setting. We've got so many, you know, there's so many different groups, there's so many different backgrounds, there's so many different stances on LGBT rights. And of course, these issues can be something which can be taken by a family basis, or an individual by individual basis. You know, what I've seen from my research is sort of more of like a very generalized overview. But of course, the complexity is immense when looking at this topic. But yeah, so hopefully, you know, as research progresses in this area, particularly looking at the UK context, which has sort of formed its own little bubble of research, I think hopefully those grey areas will become a bit less grey. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Regan, and all the speakers. We have 5 minutes left. And I think that one of the features of this webinar is that we are tackling three different, I would say, very innovative topics that are not very common in Romani studies. So I would like to ask you very briefly, and with this way we will closure to the webinar, which are the topics or the issues from your fields that you think that are urgent to be tackled regarding Romani studies, because I'm sure that you have a lot of pending research that we invite you to send to the International Romani Journal of Romani Studies. So Peter, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I will go first. I think, well, in line with my Marii Skłodowska project, I think it's urgent that we talk about racism and populism. I think this is one of the topics that interests me most at the moment, and how racism at times can be disguised under, these populist discourses, because populist discourses are always discourses of exclusion. So that's my main research interest at the moment.
Good. Thank you, Peter. I'm sure that you'll do it. Teri, do you want to go next?
Well, it's a shout out to those who might be interested in what I'm interested in, and then let's get connected. I'm very interested in health humanities, and then I discovered another thread in Hungarian literature of representing Roma identities and Roma memory, and this is related to health, coughing, smoke, and this, to my knowledge, this part of literature and this intersection of health humanities and critical Romani studies it could be something new. So if any of you is interested, let's get in touch. And just to Petra, what we experienced here in politics is that our leading party discovered two figures of that funny rich group that you were talking about. And this political exploitation is something I would draw your attention to it. It's quite horrifying.
Thank you, Teri.
Yeah, and thanks for the opportunity, really, to the organizers.
To you. You are the ones who have made the webinar. And finally, Regan, from your perspective, what do you think that would be really urgent to take up?
Well, I think this sort of looking at more sort of in the UK context, of course, we're all a bit anxious about the upcoming, impacts of the policing bill, which has gone through Parliament. There is a lot of concern amongst the community about what the potentials of this impact could be on mental health, on physical health, on the existence really of traveller people in the UK. So I think going forward, sort of reviewing the impact of that. Additionally, we're also sort of looking, I'm personally going to be looking into the impacts of climate injustice in the UK, which is having a very negative impact upon particularly the health and well-being of traveller people. So I think, going that direction will be very interesting. And then sort of maybe at some point reviewing the new status now for LGBT traveller people in light of the discriminatory policies which are coming in, which are likely to alleviate, which are likely to encourage more discriminatory attitudes amongst British society on top of what is already existing.
Really, really important. Okay, I think that we are reaching the end of this webinar. Thank you very much to Peter, to Teri, and to Regan for these amazing presentations. We invite all the audience and those who will watch this webinar in another time through our YouTube channel to read the papers, to use these papers, and also to encourage you to continue participating and collaborating with the International Journal of Romani Studies. It is a pleasure, and have a nice day. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Bye.